think this thing is going to find it distracting if I don't really share, so I want to eat it. Okay. I'll begin my speech. 3, 2, 1. 3 arguments in my speech. First, I'll explain how these bailouts affect and benefit debtors, as well as the relief for paying back the loan payments to China. Second, I'll explain why these are bad loans and better not to accept. They actively harm these countries. Finally, I'll explain how we mitigate China's power. First, I want to briefly frame what are the conditions, why we're making China intransigent, and which countries will agree to the terms of the IMF now place. So, why are we making China intransigent? First, they are predatory as a creditor. They loan specifically with the hopes that countries are not able to repay it, which I'll explain in my bad loans argument. Secondly, they actively go against the world order. They wish to subvert democracy and international institutions in order to create their own hegemony. This harms all of the world population. And third, the human rights abuses that are the same reason why we would otherwise make a country sanctioned through international organizations, that they do just as severely as North Korea, Syria, or any other states that you might think of do, probably far worse. Think of Xinjiang, think of Hong Kong, etc. Now, which countries will agree to these terms? First, countries that are in immediate need of further bailouts from the IMF. It's countries like Argentina, Somaliland, Lebanon, or South Africa, who have already received their loans from China, can't take on more of them, but would love to get this extra bailout from the IMF, which also doesn't have the same conditions of repayment. Second, it's countries who are happy for justification to stop paying back their loans. It's these East African countries or Southeast Asian countries who fear China's growing power or are unable to pay back these loans, but have had to accept these loans. Countries like Indonesia or Malaysia, countries who would love the excuse to stop paying this back. And finally, it's countries who are allied to the US and their interests. Even though Pakistan is economically tied to China, they are militarily and spyingly tied to the United States, which means that they're happy to cooperate with the United States in a place that benefits them. How does this affect debtors? First, they can't, it saves them tons of money and makes it far more likely to get bailout and are able to recover. Why does it save them significant expenditure? Debt payments are often 10 to 40% of the budget for these poor, lower income countries who have been forced to take on all of these loans. But secondly, the bailouts actively help them recover at no cost. Note, the IMF is far more likely to offer to give them these bailouts under these conditions because the IMF, controlled by Western institutions and mostly funded and backed by Western countries, wants China to not be getting back these loans, so they want to actively decrease the conditions for bailouts in order for states to opt into this because it's in their interest. Note, there's no alternative way to debt forgiveness for Chinese loans. China uses the loans in order to maintain leverage, so they don't want these loans to ever be repaid. It's not a profit-making scheme for them, like it is for a country like Switzerland. But secondly, there's no legal recourse for the debt forgiveness without negotiating with China, which they've only do if, they get to mortgage your port, which I'll explain in my argument on bad loans. No, I'll take you toward the argument. Move on to my second argument on bad loans. It's better to just not accept these loans in the first place. Why do I think they're bad? They're bad. First, they're bad in the worst of times in order to get, when they have the most geopolitical leverage. For instance, it's very turbulent political times. Before an election in Pakistan, or when there's instability in the streets in the Ivory Coast, and the government needs to be able to pay the soldiers and policemen who go onto the streets. Second, it's at times that the West isn't willing to offer you loans. When you do human rights abuses, when your economy is being mismanaged, the sort of things that we want to prevent states from being able to do. And third, they do it when they're able to opt to let's talk about thirdly, when they ask for very high interest rates with lower conditions, when you're unable to access loans directly from the West, which actively enables the backsliding of these countries, as well as harming any future democratic regime of the people who will be in deep generational debt to based on the choices of often autocratic regimes. The second reason why these loans are bad is because they specifically offer infrastructure loans at far lower conditions of viability than G20 loan standards, specifically in order to fund the sort of infrastructure projects that are going to hold the infrastructure itself as the guarantee of the loan, similarly to a house mortgage, which they want in order to get BRI control. Specifically projects that are known to be mismanaged and suboptimal for these states, not to be managed correctly or properly by locals, so that they move to Chinese hands. Both because China are more likely to manage it well and because they have more expertise, but more importantly, they utilize it as part of a greater supply chain. So they want that port, even if the port isn't profitable, in their hands, because then they can make sure to draining poor countries from their natural resources and flooding them with cheap manufactured goods. But secondly, these infrastructure projects are often a main source of profit for these countries. Countries that don't have a lot of human capital, so things like the Karachi port or the Zimbabwe mines are crucial for the long-term viability of these countries' economies. Finally, China tends to bring in their own workers, which creates significant unemployment in these countries. Note, I want you to note something. The money from the loans is inconsequential compared to the money you lose. Because you go into a debt crisis if you can't repay these loans. You're unable to fund things if your debt interest rates are really high, like China demands, and you get your crucial infrastructure controlled by China irreversibly. Finally, it's bad because it starts out with political process. Through lobbying against democratic change to prevent instability, which could harm their local corporate interests. So they actively support autocratic regimes and try to keep them in power, selling them things like tools to spy on their population or weaponry. But secondly, they actively enable the backsliding of these countries because instead of having to turn to the West, which has better conditions for loans, they're able to take these loans instead. Why do I think most countries would opt into the IMF rulings? First, because they're being directly offered a bailout rather than a loan. It's far more reliable and far cheaper in the long term because you don't have to pay it back and it doesn't put you into a debt crisis. Second, Western countries often give direct loans based on the same conditions that the IMF gives because they follow that. And finally, these countries become insulated from the negative loans that come with China's influence, which means that China doesn't get as much power over them. First and second.
How does China feel about this?
Bad. Let's talk about mitigating Chinese power. First, China can't receive payments on massive debts they are owed. They've given over the last 20 years trillions in loans, especially to poorer countries, with typically higher interest rates. So that means both their immediate income and the speculation on their bonds and on state-governed companies depends on their current and future returns on these loans. China uses this money to do terrible things, grandstanding against Taiwan, backsliding democracies across the world, preventing the rights and the protests within their countries. But secondly, they now can't offer new loans. The way they prove growth and viability of the BRI is by continuously adding new regions and new resources to their supply lines, that their manufacturing goods can reach new places. They build a belt and a road over land and sea that connects everyone along the way, which means that there's tons of speculation on the Chinese economies and companies based on the idea that they're going to reach new states. Finally, they prevent China from taking extra influence because they take away the stick and the carrot that they're able to use against smaller states. Why can't China retaliate? Answer in closing. Because China can't do trade wars or fund opponents of these states. They have an evergreen housing crisis, an unemployment crisis, a Shanghai faction questioning Xi Jinping, COVID repercussions and long-term health harms, all of which leads to an economic slowdown and forces China to focus on issues at home. This exacerbates when we take away all their funding and all the speculation for all these reasons. Opening up.
Okay, I am going to start my speech. 3, 2, 1. China is not going to take this line down, and these countries cannot afford to leave China. Secondly, why when China comes calling afterwards and demands that they repay the loan, that is going to be pretty fucking bad for this country. Cool. Before that, a couple of points of framing. One, this is not the World Bank, this is the IMF. It is a for-profit organization that earns money on people actually paying back its loans. It demands interest, and it demands that people actually do the things that they promise they're going to do. Otherwise, it won't be able to give loans to anyone else in the future. This means that it also has loads of other demands, like you have to change the way that you function with corruption, that you have to actually make this a sustainable long-term changes, blah, 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 which also means that there's a ton of red tape, and so it takes a long time to actually get this money, which means that if you are in immediate need of money, like Argentina, you still desperately need the Chinese loan now, even if you want the future IMF loan. Cool. I think that the second thing I want to just engage really quickly with is that just the IMF doesn't rule the international courts. You still have to pay back the loan because there are separate international arbitrage courts which decide who pays back. The IMF doesn't just get like, oh no, you don't have to pay back any loans anymore, and so in the future you will actually have to pay back the Chinese loans, which has been accruing interest on the principal, probably if it was extremely predatory, very quickly. And secondly, you can't use this money to actually pay back the loan, which you might have been able to do on the comparative, so it's likely the loan has grown to be very, very large. Cool. Finally, we hear that China can't afford trade war. First of all, gut check. China is the largest economy in the world, maybe second largest after the US. I feel like it can probably afford to fuck Vietnam over. But secondly, it doesn't need to fuck everyone over. It needs to fuck a couple of countries, making them go back into the Stone Age, and then every other country is like, okay, I'm not going to take that chance, and it can do that through trade wars, but it can also do that through military activity, like, for example, building artificial islands in the South China Sea on the border of the Philippines or Vietnam. There are many other levers of pressure that China can use. I'll get into it in my speech. Cool. Great. Let's get started. How are we going to win this debate in the first place? One, logical priority. We need buy-in in order to achieve the benefits that opening government wants to show. If these countries will not actually do this and will take loans from China, then we get all of the harms of them giving money to China, only worse because there was no competition. And secondly, this improves choice. Like, all we need to show is that countries some of the time get to choose, okay, we want to take only IMF loans and not China loans when it's good for us, and other times they might take both. They need to show they can never take Chinese loans. Cool. Why are these countries beholden to China despite China's past? Because we hear from opening government, oh yes, the BRI was so terrible. A few things. One, I think that just the degree to which you are dependent on China is often ignored. Vietnam mostly exports to China. A lot of ASEAN countries, China is their biggest trade partner. Tourism is a huge Chinese deal. If China is building the infrastructure within your countries, in Argentina, etc., if they decide to just stop, you don't have a port anymore. It's all very well saying, okay, great, that's the price I'm willing to pay when you're not an Argentinian, but not having fucking ports working is a pretty big deal. Fine. Secondly, I also think that you're oftentimes skeptical of the West, right? These are African countries who think that the West are going to try to overthrow them, that they can't depend on the Western loan, that the Western loans will suddenly disappear as soon as they need them if they crack down on things, which they know China won't do, so they want to take loans from China. But I also think it's not just the leaders, it's also the populace are very skeptical of the West, which means that oftentimes if it's a choice between taking the IMF loan or taking the colonialist past loan or taking the Chinese loan, they will oftentimes support their leaders in taking the China loan, which doesn't have this same taint. Thirdly, I think they're often just seriously afraid of retaliation. I mentioned things like a trade war where you're going to not be able to get your things, but it also looks like diplomatic sanctions where you might not have access to your sea through the South China Sea, where you might not be able to move your ships through, or just China encroaching on your borders with its military when it's very unlikely that the West will actually be willing to defend you because it might lead to a world war, or then potentially funding oppositional parties within your country like they do in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, and doing other things that significantly destabilize your country, and you definitely don't want to take that chance. Oh, fuck. Secondly, I also think that oftentimes... Question? Not yet. Cool. Why do you think that they want it so much that it also oftentimes outweighs the IMF bailout? Oftentimes, this is going to be that path for economic growth, right? Not being able to trade with China does a trade war, means that even if the IMF loan succeeds, they are not able to utilize that because their main trading partner isn't trading with them anymore, so it doesn't help them that they now have done all these great things and built a better economy, blah, 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 because they don't have any significant trade partners. Secondly, they oftentimes believe more that China won't stab them in the back. I said that, and they also oftentimes, I said all this stuff, so I think that in a very large extent they will fear China and are also economically dependent on China, so if push comes to shove, they're going to decide to choose China over the IMF. Cool. Secondly, why is this extremely bad? How does this win? One, I think that just, A, more money is better, both in the immediacy of it, in that this allows us to do more, this is money that we read right now, but also B, in the sense that the more money you have, the more likely it is that we actually end up achieving our goals by paying back other loans, or by building, or by being able to build stuff, or by being able to develop our economy in other ways. Secondly, competition. When the IMF and China are competing for the loans, when China has to meet the IMF's level or things like that, this means that as far as the actual conditions are better. Notice this is in direct clash with open government by showing why it's likely we get better loans from China itself, even if we end up still choosing China. And this means that they are less likely to become puppets of China. Secondly, I also think the IMF is just good. The regulation and the rules that they put in place are oftentimes very useful for these countries, and in the cases where they will take these loans, help them create a sustainable growth in the long term. Losing that because China doesn't really care that much just means that it's likely that these loans are far more likely to go to waste. Fourthly, that's it for that. So before I move on to how this hurts economic recovery, I'll take you guys on closing.
Countries receiving bailouts are in dire financial situation on both sides, and when both sides Chinese loans book them, why does it matter when it happens?
I think that A, if long term you're going to be able to rebuild more effectively, or B, you get fucked far more, then we're going to win the debate. Hadar can answer you better if you want. Cool. Why do you think this hurts the economic recovery? One, I think that oftentimes China's loans are actually good. Notice the direct contention with what OG basically assert or aren't really that good. One, because it's done with advice from the IMF. We think that oftentimes the advice from the IMF show you how to use that money in a good way. No, this isn't necessarily even just a condition. It's just the fact that once you have built this trust and this ability and you're not telling them that they're not allowed to be autonomous, then they are more likely to listen to you. But secondly, you also, China often learned from the BRI. It wants countries to take its loans for two reasons. A, because as OG say, they do have some economic issues, which means they want countries to repay them and actually make those loans worthwhile, which means they're less likely to be such extremely predatory. But B, because they don't want the backlash from international countries, they want countries to be willing to work together with them. It's not worth fucking over Africa or the Congo or whatever, that means that other countries won't want to work with you in the future. But secondly, I also want you to know that if you have taken a loan, then you are absolutely screwed. The extreme growth in the principal that you will have to pay back the loan in the future is likely to cause you to re-enter a crisis after you've paid back the debt to the IMF. You still owe China money at the end of the day, and once you have to, and it's not clear how you'll be able to pay that back. I think that you will also, this means that you're likely to default. It also means that China is less likely to forgive part of your loan, which makes it more difficult for you. And fourthly, it also means that there is less chance of
First point, China is in a uniquely dangerous time, and why that means that we have a lot of leverage in how it will respond. Secondly, why bad loans from China are a thing, and they matter most in this debate, even if Chinese pullout happens in some countries on OO. Third, why we get more Western support on the IMF, more advice and more funding, which responds to a lot of the problems that OO raised. Firstly, on why China is in a uniquely perilous time. There are three reasons that sound very debate-led, but they're incredibly true. First, the evergreen bubble burst is not just bad because it meant that China lost a lot of money, coinciding with the fact that they also have a growing middle class that's able to produce less and needs more. It is specifically bad because China is currently competing with the more developed economies of the West on higher order goods, like semiconductors that they're trying to develop on their own. This is where a lot of their investment goes. The problem with that is that China has now shown the West and Western investors that they are untrustworthy like Western countries in the sense that they're unable to financially manage well industries like basic real estate. The second reason is that the Shanghai faction is gaining traction within China. This is important because both since Xi Jinping has failed to meet his 2025 Taiwan goal, meant that right now it is actually important for Xi Jinping to maintain internal popularity, so lower order members of the CCP are able to join him and support him over the Shanghai faction. The third reason is COVID, which is literally just immediate costs that they need to build back, given the amount of hospital destruction that exists in China, which coincides with the popularity importance that I've just explained. The reason that all of this is important is China is incredibly self-oriented right now. It needs to build back itself. It needs to get back popularity. It needs to show military support. Why is this important? If on their side a country rejects this, notice what will happen to China if they then choose to do things like arm the port in Karachi, which is literally what Yishai fucking says they will do. It's not any more lukewarm manner of imposing pressure on these countries. First, it means that the West sees soldiers entering a country that the IMF has just legitimized objecting to China. It means people on the ground in Karachi. It means taking away the ownership of these people, which seems optically awful to countries that are perceived as far more vulnerable. Secondly, it's the fact that the West wants to alleviate these countries from China, so it's just looking for an excuse in order to spin why China is doing bad things and to impose sanctions upon it. Lastly, these things are obviously costly. If you have to fund massive amounts of political pressure in order to engage in the trade wars that Yishai talks about, this means you're cutting amounts of trade revenue as well as military resources in order to impose yourself on these countries. And note, because the IMF does this at one time, they're right that we can't impose this whenever a country gets a loan. But that also means they have to deal with everyone that's doing this, with every single country all at the same time. It is simply too costly. The backlash can't be too large. Maybe for some states they'll try to maintain, for others they'll never be able to. Undoing bad loans. What are the responses we get? They will still pay. The countries that took the loans will still have to pay because this isn't international law. First of all, the WTO and the IMF are almost the same fucking institution. They have the same president. They get trained in the same academies. We think that there's also a lot of crossover between them because they perform similar functions of an international order of trade. So justifications from the IMF are likely to be credited. But secondly, who the fuck cares about international institutions? Actually, what have they ever done? Their legitimacy in terms of saying what's real or not matters like little. If the West legitimizes this, and I don't think the West will sanction me, there's no problem engaging with it. If anything, they explain why you align more with the West that has legitimized my not taking, my forgiveness of a loan and just not paying China back. The second thing we have to tell you is that these loans are just bad and we want to disincentivize countries from taking them. And note, this is a different population of countries. Countries that are currently Western aligned and have taken IMF loans in the past, but China is reaching into. The classic example here is Southeast Asia that's antagonized from China, but has to start taking loans because China is becoming more powerful and more geopolitically strong in the area. Countries like Indonesia that want to oppose these loans and have been IMF aligned in the past. What does this mean? For these countries, they will have to take it in the vulnerable situations that Ayal says, unless they commit to this. Why are Chinese loans bad? First, notice that all of Ayal's explanations on why they're bad is also why it's better than just asking for repayment. Things like denying my ability to use the port means that I, as China, don't just get repayment of the loan of the country that owes me, I also get to decide which trade goes through there. It's basically another port in another country. If I get to put my people there and my own jobs there, that means I'm gaining more money because of the lack of manufacturing jobs currently in China with the population surge. All of this means that they would rather do the more predatory loans because it gives them an edge over the West that only asks for repayments. Otherwise, if they only engage in trade, they will never catch up. This means that they do defer to predatory loans. The reason this matters more is that it is long-term. Maybe China will backlash to some extent. There are ways to deal with this by being supported by the West, and when China leaves, it leaves. When they take the bad loans and then the port doesn't make profit forever, that's when you lose out on more money. Let's now talk about Western support. The IMF is not just an altruistic institution. It responds to the strategic and economic incentives of the West. This is why 40% of the IMF is currently funded by North America. We think that what this means is that on their side, given that China and other allies don't fund the IMF, the only significant change in IMF funding might come from Western support. Why does Western support decrease significantly? First, obviously the strategic and economic alignment. I'm not going to analyze why the US doesn't like China. Ayal had a wonderful Trump impression that shows this. Before I explain second half. Top half.
Yeah. The worse China economic stake is, the less bargaining power it has, and the more likely that you can get good loans from them. This means they have more incentives to give good loans that will lead to.
But the problem, Yishai, is that for many countries, the bad loans have already happened, which means that the conditions are currently bad, like the current port in Karachi. Our second claim is that in the future, they will recover and then start making worse loan agreements. And so we need those countries to accept the IMF now so that in the future, when China recovers, they're not out of facility. So the first reason is on strategic alignment. Things like Taiwan, Ukraine, Israel, in which China is averse, means that the West is far, far more wary of providing funding to these countries. The second reason is consistency. If I don't know if a country will start aligning with China and impose mass austerity or start centralizing its economy without my knowing as the IMF, this is incredibly scary. The IMF trauma of an Argentinian central bank that they had to bail twice in 20 years is what they want to most avoid, so to not be seen as a failure. On our side of the house, they have to conform to the West. You get more money because they invest more in you in the first place. They provide you advice. Notice this response to everything OO tells you. That's the shortage they're talking about. That's why the IMF can't replace, because the West is scared of investing through the IMF. If we prove the West is willing to, that solves that. For all those reasons, I'll keep
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister and to close up the first half of this debate, we invite the Deputy Leader of
I'll rebut OG out of this debate, then I'm going to show why we win on buying, and lastly, I will weigh why we have the strongest impacts in this debate that should be logically prior to anything else, but I'll have my proof. Let's start by rebutting OG out of this debate. I'll start with their first line. They say that the IMF offers you bailouts at no cost. I'm not sure where they case file, but the IMF is a for-profit organization that only and exclusively gives loans. They do not have a fiat changes in the debate. Even if they did, they should have modeled this, they never did. So you will have to pay back the IMF loan anyway. This is also inherent because the IMF needs you to pay back because it doesn't have any other source of money, and therefore it needs the loan back to be able to pay other countries. It's not the World Bank, it is not a charity organization. Secondly, their second line, the idea of, oh, we now give countries an excuse to not pay China, and of course they don't want to pay back their debt. Duh, obviously they don't want to pay back their debt, and if they could just forget their debt, they would have already done it. But no, their fiat in this motion is that the IMF demands them to not pay back the debt. They have zero fiat on any other international organization, on China or anything else. Why does it mean that they will still need to eventually pay back the debt and will be held to consequences if they don't? One, because China does not consider this as an excuse. And I will double down more on what I already proved and how China will retaliate in my buying point. Secondly, because the WTO will also not accept this as an excuse. Amitai lies to you when he says that the WTO is interlinked with the IMF. Panel, the WTO has more than 15% of its money being Chinese money. The WTO is heavily influenced by China. This is just factually wrong. Thirdly, even if they could have changed the WTO or other or international law organizations or so on, you know what? We don't think it changes anything because China never give a fuck. Consider this. The International Court has already decided that the territories China claims to have ownership over in the Filipino islands are belonging to the Philippines. You know what China did? It said, I think this court is biased, this is mine, it belongs to me, and it sent warships there. And now, even if it couldn't conquer them, the Philippines are too afraid to use them for anything and to build businesses there because they don't want to enter a war with China. So even if they could get the WTO or the International Court on their side, China would not accept it. Lastly, we think that regardless of all of this, even if all international organizations are on their side and China would do nothing, it would still be a massive issue because of international credit agencies and FDI. Credit agencies like Fitch obviously make your credit worse when they see that you're not paying back your loans, making the interest you have to pay on any future loan higher because you're considered more risky. Similarly, FDI, which is not even countries, but just private corporations like Amazon, will see that you're a riskier organization and not want to work with you as much. So there are massive, massive costs they cannot ignore that eventually these countries will have to pay back the loan after the bailout or will be held to consequences if they don't. Third thing I want to rebut on this debate, the idea of China having predatory loans. I want to say a few things. One, we said this in a POI, the more Amitai analyzes how much China is currently weak,
the more he has to concede that these countries have a higher leverage against China in handling these predatory loans. If China is so vulnerable, it would have to accept things such as, I need another year before I can pay you back. Secondly, I think that this is so 2018. Yes, it was true in Sri Lanka. It was true when BRI started. Panel, if you follow recently, most of the BRI loans of recent years in Iran, in Pakistan, in Argentina have been fucking great. You know why? For all the reasons Yishai analyzed and Amitai never rebutted. Both because they want to avoid international backlash, they want more people to buy into their loans, and because they need their money back. So it is a lie when Ayal says they don't care about this being actually a well-managed project. They want it to be well-managed so you can pay them back because they need the money as you concede. Thirdly, we think that we still have other IMF conditions on our side panel. And this is crucial, because when you still have IMF, the problem with Chinese loan is not the money, but when it comes with no strings attached and bad management, this is when it becomes predatory and a debt trap because you can't pay it back. But when you still take the IMF loan on our side, in addition to the Chinese loans, then the IMF would require things such as cut public spending, cut corruption, be transparent, and a bunch of regulations to ensure that the projects are run well. So we get the best of both worlds, Chinese money with IMF good management. Lastly, we think, okay, I think this is enough, honestly, I want to finish the case. Cool. Barrie, why do we win this? Several reasons. One, I want to observe a crucial framing in this debate. The motion says that they need to not allow countries to take Chinese loans or pay them back. On our side, if indeed they are correct that the Chinese loans are so bad for them, or if indeed they are correct that it is better for them to wait out until they pay the debt, they can choose to do this. In fact, the IMF can advise them without forcing them to do this. The only delta in this debate is on countries that wouldn't voluntarily choose to opt out of Chinese loans. And this already tells you that they obviously want these Chinese loans and are less likely to buy into the IMF. Secondly, we think that these countries are often semi-authoritarian already. Think of Vietnam, think of Indonesia, think of Pakistan. This means they can afford to suffer short-term poverty by not getting the IMF bailout, and they fear much more Chinese meddling that would directly impact them as opposed to the people who don't vote for them, such as Chinese meddling in politics, coups, and so on, which they fear much more. Before I continue closing.
So it's unclear. If these countries are anti-democracy, as you say, and the only way to get IMF loans is to impose democratic norms, why would they not be already going to China on both sides of the house?
The countries that already go to China on both sides of the house don't change under the debate and don't have the burden to prove a perfect world. I can concede that some countries don't buy in anyway, but we think less countries buy in on our side. We also think that these countries can be semi-authoritarian but still be willing to take more money because more money is good. Cool. Secondly, we think that a lot of these projects are in the middle already. China started the infrastructure project but didn't finish them. If you don't pay them back, you know what China will do? Will fucking ruin them. Will fucking use the land that they are currently controlling with their factories there to pollute it, to make it uninhabitable. They have very easy ways to punish you. Lastly, you are literally entering a territorial dispute with China because it would claim that you owe it this a collateral for your debt because it demanded, as HUJI concedes, a collateral for most of its loans, what did to nationalize a lot of the ports and so on. And when it sees itself as having it belonging to her, it doesn't matter what the global international institutions say, it will take actions. Why do we win? Several reasons. One, choice. In cases where the loans are bad, these countries will choose to not take them. This means that on choice metric, we show that the likelier cases in the debate are the ones we show. Secondly, logical priority. If we don't get volume, you neither get the benefits of the IMF, but you also make Chinese control even worse because you get uncontrolled Chinese control. Beg you to vote.
recreational IMF buy-in, why you make the IMF more able to operate more like more countries. Firstly, on bailout, I think notably China don't have an incentive to do the kind of things that opening opposition are talking about. Firstly, because there's a concession in top half that China just is less rich. That means that if countries are like literal like financial instability and require huge amounts of money, it's unclear they have the necessary resources to bail them out to begin with. But secondly, they don't necessarily care about success, which is again something that opening opposition failed to respond to. I think at that point, China is less likely to want to do the bailouts that are give them the actual resources that they need. But secondly, they say, no, you just don't want to work with the IMF, or you're more willing to go towards China. I think again, I think that even if that's the case, it happens on both sides, because there are reasons why, for example, Democratic Republic of Congo or Guinea don't want to work with the IMF, and it is because of them imposing the democratic norms that opening opposition are talking about and saying that these countries are so against. I think at the point where they're saying that you are so against, like it's unclear why an authoritarian country that has consolidated power and resources into the people that are running that country would ever want to lose the power that opening opposition say that they like so much. And so then I'm unclear why it is ever a case in status quo or on their comparative that you are going towards the IMF and China at the same time, given the conditions that are often imposed are different. For that reason, I don't think you have the same pivot away from the IMF and towards China. I do think that you buy into these loans on our side of the house. Beyond that, why do you get more money and more for the IMF to actually be able to give loans to more countries? First, maybe because they have to repay the IMF first as per the motion. Why is that good? Firstly, because it gets the money back quicker. At the point where you are forced to repay the debt to the IMF first, it means you recoup the stake that you have given to that country much faster. That means you are more able to offer it out again to more countries in the case that a country is going to you for something like a development loan. The comparative is that when you have to have a repayment to multiple to China at the same time, it means you are more likely to have to either lower the amounts that are paid in terms of the interest payment that you make on that debt, whether you extend out the repayment window or something along those lines. What that means is that it takes longer for you to accrue the amount of money you gave to China, that you gave to that country in the first place in that bailout, which means you then have less money to repay out when it comes to things like loan applications, which is often the IMF does for things like infrastructure projects in countries which don't need bailouts. Secondly, it lowers the risk of those bailouts to be given in the first place. Because note, when a country is on literal financial, on its financial knees, it is very risky for you to offer them a bailout, because oftentimes it means they've done something really, really badly, or that they have economic conditions that are going to make it difficult for them to repay those kinds of things to you. At that point then, you need to be sure that they are going to be able to, or you need to at least have some degree of, if this lessens the risk they are going to have to, for example, not be able to pay that back to you, and therefore you are more likely to be willing to either loan it out to them or loan out more amounts to them, because you're more certain of their ability to repay that. That looks like, even if opening opposition wants to say this is a for-profit organization, it means that they lower the interest rates dramatically, or also offer zero interest rate loans that the IMF has been known to do in the past. That means that at that point, not only are you more willing to give out those loans because there's less risk attached to them, but also because of that less risk and as a result of lower interest, those countries are then more able to make those repayments to begin with, because the interest and debt servicing on them is much less expensive, and that means that over time, that further compounds into the IMF being more able and less risky to give out more loans in just more areas. The impact of this is quite simple. It gives more ability for the IMF to just give out more loans and bailouts, because the money comes back quicker, because it's less risky to give more money, and countries are able to pay it back, and notably, because opening governments say, this is their mechanism for how you get better buy-in from the IMF is just saying, the West hates China, and if you hate China too, the West will support you that bit more. I think what is a much better mechanism for getting countries to buy into you more is showing that you are implementing a system that means that the money that they give you is more likely to be put to better use at the point where it comes back to you faster and much more easily, and countries are able to make those repayments much significantly easier. What that means is that you are much more able to demonstrate a proven track record of loans or bailouts being successful and actually helping countries out of the conditions you are aiming to buy from that yet. And that means that you are more able to get more countries buying into you, claiming opening government's impact, but I just think a much more certain metric as opposed to just like ideology or like political grandstanding. And what people actually care about when it comes to like the billions of dollars that we're talking about here is whether actual shit gets done with it. We prove shit gets done better. This means, before I go on,
Even as we prove Chinese loans are good and irritating China harms your economy, it makes you less likely to pay back the IMF.
So here's the thing. We are talking about countries again on their financial needs. China notably, because it doesn't implement the democratic norms and stuff like that, often the payment windows are shorter or interest payments are higher, because that makes them more favorable. Because that's like the thing of like, we won't make you do these things, but you have to make the payments higher, or you have to pay us back in a shorter window. That just means that even if China is attempting to fuck you over, which is the opening government push, the conditions of those loans just mean that the countries that we're talking about here, the ones in the worst financial situation, are by definition less able to meet shorter repayment windows or make higher debt servicing payments. So that means that you do just have countries that are less able, that are going to be fucked on either, like both sides of the house from these Chinese loans. And at that point, I just think that it matters significantly less at what point they get fucked at, because we're never given the impacting of what the difference is of like 5 or 10 years before China takes all your shit and puts all your people into poverty. I think at that point, what actually matters is what is able to be made a competitive difference in the debate, which is that countries are better able to develop because bailouts are better or come with less stringent conditions that allows people to maintain some standard of living in those countries. Like all of their welfare doesn't get cut versus all of it getting cut because of those things. Or more development loans can be given from the IMF simply because they have more money. It looks like more hospitals being built in other countries, more infrastructure, better business stimulation that allows those countries to develop consistently. The weighing over this on opening government and kind of also opening opposition is firstly on opening government scale. OG exclusively deals with countries that are already struggling from Chinese debt. Again, it is unclear the comparative impact of this. What we explain to you is that when the IMF just has more money in general to be able to give out to more countries, that affects all countries, not just the ones that are already going to be fucked over from receiving Chinese loans. I think this is more countries, or at least affects a broader scope of countries, and also I think also on intensity of impact. I don't think there's a suspicion, I think it's kind of unclear which country is slightly worse or slightly better off from the awful loans that are characterized in top half, but I do think that it's much clearer whether or not you are able, whether or not that difference in like a couple of million gets you more infrastructure, better electricity, or whatever in the developing countries that rely on those things to be able to provide people's basic needs. Over opening opposition, again, I think it is also a degree of comparative. Like Chinese loans just do fuck countries, it is empirically true. I mean, if they're going to be fucked on either side, especially if they're needing these bailouts to begin with, what should matter in the debate is on which side you were able to make the biggest amount of difference. At the point where it is unclear, like they never proved that these countries can just get out of the Chinese debt traps, saying at that point it is more, what matters more is whether countries can actually do things with the other functions that the IMF carries out. I think you are better able to do that at the point where the IMF just has more capacity to begin with to do the things that all teams are talking about that actually help people like develop, like do all those things better. For all of those reasons, so proud of you.
I'm going to respond to closing opposition first and talk through the two cases. The first of which is that you definitely need this infrastructure, so it doesn't matter where you come from. Second of which is why you are now unlikely to be able to have the capacity to give as good IMF loans due to the risk that now the IMF see, or countries see in relation to giving IMF loans. Firstly then on the infrastructure thing, because I think it is unintuitive. Given that it is likely because there is more people into the future, we should care about those individuals, given that those lives are also going to count a huge amount. What that means is that we are able to prove that China is a bad actor and is not going to upkeep the type of infrastructure that we talk about generally, then that infrastructure is at risk into the future anyway, which means that if we are able to access good infrastructure and good investment from the IMF and continue to give IMF loans that are going to be beneficial to individuals and bailouts that are going to be beneficial to individuals in the developing world, this is far more preferable, because then we have the capacity to give out bailouts and loans that are actually in the interest of these individuals rather than in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party in order to try and regain money on the debt they give out to the people. So what I think this means is that while yes, in the short term, they may be able to get some money in order to build hospitals, we say that we're still able to access money on our side, but that money is going to be used
used in a far more positive way, and in the long term, it is also going to be more sustainable insofar as your ability to pay back those loans is all probably going to be better insofar as the IMFs is less likely to give you such terrible deals on your loans. They're less likely to give you such short-term repayment cycles, and so you're going to be able to even access them. Because the fear on their side of the house is regardless of whether or not you take this deal or not, China is likely to destroy that infrastructure, which was literally one of the mechanisms that was given in opening opposition. So what we think that this means for the first case is that they have to tell us why it's the case that into the long term, taking these short-term deals is actually going to be beneficial. Secondarily, we don't understand how the second case actually interacts with our case. Because we say, when you have the ability to pay back the IMF first, this gives a huge amount of security and far lessens the risk to these IMF loans. Insofar as you don't have a competing actor that you have to give back huge amounts of monies to on cycles, now you have the capacity to pay back those IMF loans, and they become something that actors who donate to the IMF or who appeal to the IMF know are going to be secure. Meaning that on our side of the house, we do have the capacity to ensure that the IMF is seen as something that is far more consistent and secure in the way that it operates, therefore is able to give out more money and more loans and more bailouts to more countries, thus accessing our benefits. They never actually respond to our marginalization here, and they never actually tell us why, they just give us competing analysis. But we say that ours is like logically prior, insofar as if you are literally just able to garner more money from the user payments, this is like far less steps to attain our impact than it is within their impact, and so theirs is inherently more uncertain, meaning that uncertainty, you should definitely weigh us above that. Secondly then, on OO, because OO's like main push against us, I think, is the idea that Chinese bailouts or whatever are actually positive for countries, and therefore we should be actually allowing individuals to deal. Yes, go for it.
Your case asserts creditors that lend from China are likelier to fail and default on their IMF loans, which is the whole talk has clashed. Even then, your delta is the loans being repaid a little later while creditors finish repaying China. Big deal.
Okay. Hadar says that this was so 2018. I was in school in 2008. But what I'm going to say now is that because of the way in which China is economically, it is literally the case that they have to be better in relation to how they acted with those Belt and Road Initiative like loan offers, because they were in a weak position, and so they weren't able to enact the way they were previously. Meaning that into the future, if China gets more economically prosperous, then it is likely that they are going to return to their previous practices because they have more leverage over them. The only way that they continue to become more economically viable is if they continue to have access to debt repayment, if countries continue to take on debt from China, and continue to allow China to build infrastructure in their areas and take on their loans. We think that what this means is that on their side of the house, they just allow China to continue to go towards the type of deals that they were doing previously that did fuck people over in 2018 when I was 17. What I think this means is that we are then able to show that it is actually the fact that just because currently the Chinese loans may be beneficial, in the long run, again weighing on the long-term capacity for us to benefit individuals, we are still able to benefit the most amount of individuals. What then about opening government? Because opening government's mechanism is literally just the West hates China. Therefore, we should, that's a reason as to why the IMF, or as to why Western Institute, why the IMF isn't going to engage with the IMF in a beneficial way. We say the mechanism is actually that when you are able to get better economic stability through the mechanism that Chen gave you insofar as you are now able to receive this money faster, that is a far stronger mechanism. Because if it is to be believed that the profit-driven incentives of individuals is true, then that is something that they would prioritize over something ideological that would change from person to person who is in charge of these organizations. But if they are always profit-driven, then it is the case that being able to receive this money immediately back is something that is always going to take priority. Thus, our mechanization is stronger, and so thus the mechanization in regards to getting that benefit is something that we are able to take. Finally, then, in relation to opening opposition, there's some more things that they say in regards to China, in regards to how China will act. I think they're just simply ridiculous. They say that the types of things that China are going to do to the countries that they have already offered these bailouts and loans to is going to be horrific. They're going to destructure them. They're going to destroy the infrastructure that they have already put into these areas. Panel, we just think that this is incredibly unlikely. If China gets weaker, they're not going to destroy infrastructure that they have already put money into. It's likely that they want to be able to appeal to these actors further down the line. They want to be able to use these types of ports, use these bridges, use these hospitals into the future. This means that it's unlikely that they're going to destroy these countries. It is unlikely that they're going to act in a way that is incredibly inefficient and irresponsible. For all of those reasons, those are
I'd like to thank the government keep as close to the border. I find your position with.
I can't plug it in, but I did sure get the lower battery notification, so we roll. Not good, we roll. Panel, sometimes you're in a dodgy relationship. Your partner gets really jealous of the kisses you give to the dog and they say, no more, it's me or the dog. And I'm sorry, government, but if the dog is buying their exports and building their infrastructure, then at least occasionally they're going to choose the dog. And that's all we need to win from CO. Simple. The IMF functions by giving profit back to its creditors. That's why creditors give money. Now the IMF relies on hospitals, the creditors pull out, the IMF becomes exponentially moving into the future. How are we insulated from the rest of the day? One, some countries who are dependent on China and the IMF have to walk away from the IMF. Even if you believe that there's just a 1% additional likelihood on CO that this happens than on OO, for example, when I'm talking about new mechanisms, the Darren, etc., I think we act as a second premise independently of CO. More on this in a second. Why is it bad for IMF? Independently, two separate reasons. One, because some of the creditors also rely on China for things like manufacturing, electronics, etc. They pull out, they can't afford to get into a war with China. Secondly, independently of that, because some of them just want money back. Optically, now if they might not get their loans repaid, at least until the debtors decide. We only need one of them to work to get our impacts, and I think that we are also insulated from the even if China can't retaliate responses from the government. Let's contrast this with CG's new stuff and their responses to us. I think we're analytically required in their first case to prove our case to beat them. When they say that we're able to give this money back out and get it back, it's contingent on the IMF getting the money back in the first place. Even if you think that's more of an O response than a CO one, we're going to have to scale them by showing that this amount of money doesn't matter in comparison to the amount of money that you will lose from creditors pulling out the IMF or weighing this when I chat OO in a section. The second thing they do, which in response to us and to their case, is they say that the IMF is now more certain that you'll repay them in the future, so they give out smarter loans. I'm not convinced why the IMF doesn't already just only give out loans that they think are trustworthy. TD is missing it. What's the capacity gap? Why the IMF cannot, with offensive role, identify which countries will and won't repay? I think it's really easy to do this because you look at A, their track record, and B, the extent that they owe money to China. Basically, the realistic comparison debate is you probably choose to give money as the IMF to the countries that are also paying money back to China, only if they still look at things that will apply to pay you back. You stop giving money to those that can't pay you back, you don't take a blanket policy that is extreme to do this. Let's talk OO, CG, and how to accept their growth content. Right, why are we not agreeing to this OO? The biggest threat to us right now, genuinely, is to think that our impact about the West will now IMF. Secondly, the fact that some countries will choose China instead. I think there are a couple of reasons. One, because I think that the burden of omitted, which is nuanced but crucial, is why is it the same countries who are China money but also owe the IMF money to a significant extent? We hear from them why some countries are China money, but not to a huge extent why it's the same. But it's only when it's the same we actually get a trade-off. The reasons for why we scale should be higher, we tell you that the growth of China, as AIB knows, is just more recent, right? BRI or the projects they've been doing are more recent. They are more recent challenge to the existing global hegemony, which was the West. The West is far older and has that global dominance. What this means then is I think that many countries have taken these loans from China, and they also have the ability and incentive to look good enough to take loans previously, because they look good enough in China, they look good enough at other actors before. So before China was the best option, before China came onto the scene, they had loans from the IMF. These are often big loans, but the large infrastructure projects, the IMF is a big organization. These take many, many decades to pay back. And so you also know a large amount of money from both these actors, which is why this is important. This is actually necessary in order for OO to achieve their impacts at best for CO, in terms of how you weigh that up. It really not worse for us, it's proven a different way when you sometimes go to China. Yishai then comes close to our impact, and he says that now you're not paying IMF back, so you have less money for other things. CG attempts to flip this. This is the case about the amount of money the IMF has to give back out. Why would we think both of these? I think our case about the amount of creditors withdraw and the amount of money that is one compounding and exponential to that. The second thing is not just money owed by somebody who debtors, right? I think that this is more important for a really simple reason. As the world economy is growing over time, things get more expensive, things get worth more money is being paid in now than was owed before. Essentially, the economy grows, AIB notice. Globalization also happens as countries want to go to bonds and see the success other countries have had with the IMF become more willing to invest within it. What that means is more money is being paid into the IMF now than was before. More money is being given out to loans now than was before. The amount of money that you will receive back between the money that you have from the loans you gave out is less than the amount of money that you are currently putting into the IMF. So I think that on that very, very basic level, you're putting more in now than you put in earlier. So you care more about putting the money in now than getting back money that you put in earlier. I think that's really important. I think this is why we outscale those impacts in short time. Let's talk about OG and the sort of relative parts of CG then. I think the crux of this comparison is that lots of OG is contingent on countries not abandoning the IMF to China. They grew by this case lots and lots, maybe even most of the time if you think that they're doing really well, but not necessarily the most important instances. You're welcome, by the way. The Australians know that they want to make amendments to the Celebic story, right? Ayal said at the end, in response to my POI, that China's really weak right now, so they can't backpass, but they have to lose or give away money, blah, blah, blah. In which case, I'm a little uncertain as to how exactly they're working to offer out all these new loans as well in the future, and so I don't really know how significant their impacts can be. But I also think that we can frame when you take China's loans and why. Because the other gap in OG is if you can just go to the IMF instead, as if this is the comparison you have, why the fuck do you ever take loans from China, given how bad they supposedly are based on OG's characterization? The answer is basic. Sometimes they're bad, sometimes they're good. When you take bad ones, when in the short term they were only option, for whatever reason the IMF wants to give you money, when the terms are sometimes slightly favorable to you. When you're already dependent on China, even if you were to withdraw, they would backlash in a significant way. You're smart as a country, right? You know what loans to choose, you've seen the bad things that happen to places like Sri Lanka, you can kind of take that into decision-making calculus. What we say basically that is that all it means by you take loans from China in these instances are pretty happy. This frame also, by the way, gives false responses to our first case, we're still having that. What does this mean then? I think there's two things for these two cases. One, the idea that these are bad loans, and that is not to accept in the future. What we've said explains why the minimal delta on the bad loans specifically. Because the bad loans are probably the ones that you were already contingent on, and that's why you took bad loans. You took that because you didn't really have another option, and so I think you still don't have another option. You don't know why you get more options now. Effectively, you get fewer options based on the case. But the thing that we say is there is actually a delta on the good loans. The Chinese gives out good loans when they know that you could go to other options. This is when they have to give you those favorable deals. This is when they have to give you those favorable things. You wouldn't have half the country owing money to China if it was always checked every single time they did this. So I think that you lose the ability to get those more positive loans from the conditions and the negative loans coming up. The second thing we say is it's good to have a way out and not have to repay these loans. I think that the most important countries are those that don't have the choice simply not to repay China. Right? The most important countries are those that are in the most dire straits right now. They're in the debt trap, they need lots of money. They can't just go and say, okay, we're going to ignore you completely. I think these countries should care about most in Spain. They then say that the West wants to give money to countries that may also ally with China. I'm sorry, I think this is a wildly unnuanced take on the state of the world. Countries engage with both the West and China as a show, right? You get different benefits from both. The West provides services, lots of aid through IMF. We talk about China provides different kinds of manufacturing technology and other types of aid, loans that we talk about as well. The choice doesn't force on the emotion, right? When you start abandoning these countries in the non-IMF ways as well, because now you can't give money to these countries because they want China instead, so now you also abandon them intelligence, military support, non-monetary aid, transfer prices, etc. I think what all this means is it's me anti-God, because if it's not, then I'm going to get abandoned by all my friends to be really with them.